salt fog of the North Carolina coast did not merely obscure the land, it erased it in the autumn of 1587, while the desperate inhabitants of the Roanoke colony scanned the grey horizon for English supply ships that would never arrive. Thomas Harriot, a cartographer whose disgraced standing in London had driven him to the edge of the known world, stood at the tree line with ink-stained fingers. Thomas was not looking for British sails. He was waiting for Mantea's sister, Wanchese, a master weaver of the Croatan people, whose loom held secrets no royal surveyor could comprehend. To the governor and the soldiers, the surrounding wilderness was a wall of green, untamed malice. To Thomas, guided by Wanchese's silent direction, it was a tapestry waiting to be decrypted. Their meetings were clandestine, held beneath the ancient twisted live oaks where the maritime forest met the sound. Official colonial doctrine strictly forbade trading European steel or paper for indigenous goods without the magistrate's consent, but Thomas had long abandoned interest in King Elizabeth's decree. Survival demanded a different currency. Wanchese brought garments crafted from dyed cedar bark, deer sinew, and wild indigo. What Thomas had discovered months earlier and kept hidden even from his journal was that her patterns were not merely decorative. The deliberate geometry of the stitches mapped the treacherous shifting sandbars of the Outer Banks, the deep water channels invisible to heavy English galleons, and the freshwater springs buried deep within the marsh. Wanchese, recognizing the cartographer's rare gift for reading spatial geometry, used the loom to translate her ancestors' unwritten geography into tactile ciphers. In return, Thomas provided refined iron needles, indigo pigment, and precise astronomical charts calculating the movements of the moon, information Wanchese used to predict the high tides that swept through the inlets. As the colony's provisions dwindled and paranoid rumors of impending conflict began to stir among the settlers, Thomas knelt beside Wanchese in the damp marsh grass. She handed him a freshly woven sash, its deep blue and crimson threads forming an intricate, jagged spiral. As his fingers traced the raised cotton knots, Thomas realized this was no ordinary map. It showed a hidden aquatic passage leading away from the island, past the reach of both English warships and hostile native factions. "The ships from home will not return before the frost, Thomas," Wanchese murmured in her accented English, her dark eyes reflecting the somber light of the grey coast. "When the fort falls silent, follow the weave." In that quiet exchange beneath the misty pines, the true narrative of Roanoke shifted. The lost signal was not a call for rescue sent across the Atlantic, but an unwritten pact forged in thread and ink along the forgotten shore. By midwinter, the quiet anxiety in Roanoke had turned into a suffocating panic. The horizon remained stubbornly empty. The long-promised supply ships from England were nowhere to be seen, trapped across the Atlantic by the brewing war with the Spanish Armada. Inside the palisade, hunger gnawed at the settlers' resolve, and suspicion spread like a contagion. Colonial officers blamed the local tribes for their plight, while native elders viewed the desperate armed foreigners as a disease that needed to be purged. Amidst this mounting tension, Thomas Harriot locked himself inside his drafty wooden cabin, lit only by a dying tallow candle. Spread across his workbench was the sash Wanchese had given him, alongside his own parchment charts. Under the magnified lens of his glass, the intricate craft revealed its true genius. The textiles were not just artistic patterns, they were a complex three-dimensional spatial cipher. Wanchese's dye choices represented water depths, indigo for navigable channels, pale root dyes for dangerous shallows. The tension of the weave indicated currents, and the specific knot patterns marked concealed tributaries snaking through the inland swamps. It was an unwritten atlas of a hidden world, detailing untracked waterways that bypassed every known tribal border and colonial watchtower. This discovery changed everything. It offered a secret route to survival, but one that defied both English authority and native tribal rivalries. To the English commanders, fleeing into the interior with indigenous guidance was treason. To the local chieftains, sharing these ancestral roots with a European was a betrayal punishable by death. A sharp knock on Thomas's door shattered the silence. Outside, heavy boots crunched against the frost, and the shouting of angry men echoed from the settlement's center. Governor White's militia was preparing a preemptive raid on a nearby native village, convinced it was the only way to secure food. Thomas quickly folded the sash and hid it beneath his wool coat. The fabric pressed warm against his chest, a quiet compass guiding him away from the doomed fort. Stepping out into the freezing mist, he made his choice. He would not fire a musket for a dying empire. Instead, under the cover of the midnight raid, he vanished into the shadows of the cypress trees to find Wanchese. Winter descended upon the coastal frontier with a biting, unforgiving frost. Behind them, the Roanoke settlement was fracturing under the weight of fear, while off the coast, rogue Spanish privateers prowled the foggy sound, searching for vulnerable English outposts to plunder. Caught between English muskets, Spanish cannons, and angry tribal factions, Thomas and Wanchese fled into the vast, uncharted expanse of the Great Dismal Swamp. The swamp was a labyrinth of black water, submerged roots, and towering cypress trees draped in ghostly Spanish moss. To an outsider, it was a watery grave, but as they maneuvered their narrow dugout canoe through the dark channels, Wanchese's woven sash served as their living compass. Thomas tracked their progress not with a brass sextant, but by matching the raised knots of the cipher against the distinct groupings of cypress knees and twisted waterways. Every weave predicted a safe passage where heavy boats would founder. They were not merely running to survive, they were preserving a legacy. Deep within the swamp's ancient interior, on a secluded island of dry pine hammocks untouched by European eyes, they sought a safe haven. Here, far from European greed and tribal warfare, they set out to hide the shared knowledge of two colliding worlds. Working side by side in a hollowed-out cypress trunk lined with water-resistant pine resin, Thomas deposited his detailed astronomical charts, botanical notes, and maps of the coastline. Wanchese placed her hand-woven ciphers beside them, along with carved wooden tokens detailing the oral histories of her people. Together, this archive formed a bridge between Western science and ancient indigenous wisdom, a blueprint of the land as it truly was, unmarred by conquest. As distant gunshots echoed from the outer sounds, a grim sign of Spanish raiders clashing with English patrols, Thomas sealed the wooden chest and buried it beneath the roots of an ancient grandmother cypress. The swamp swallowed the secret whole. Armed soldiers and privateers could burn the forts and claim the coast, but the true knowledge of the land was now safely locked within the swamp's impenetrable heart, waiting for a future that knew how to listen. 30 years after the disappearance of the Roanoke colony, a new generation of English surveyors pushed deeper into the uncharted forests of Virginia. Expecting to find bleached bones, rusted armor, or the grim remains of a massacre, the expedition moved cautiously along the black water channels of the interior swamps. What they uncovered instead defied every map and manifesto drawn in London. Deep beyond the reach of colonial taxation and tribal wars, hidden within a sunlit valley sheltered by tall pines, stood a thriving settlement. It was neither an English fort nor an indigenous village, but something entirely new. Timber-framed cabins featured roofs thatched with woven palmetto leaves. Iron plows worked fields of corn, beans, and indigo. The people who emerged to greet the astounded surveyors wore garments made of woven cedar fiber, dyed deep crimson, secured with English brass buckles. They spoke a rich, melodious dialect, an unrecognizable blend of Elizabethan English, Croatan phrasing, and melodic trade signals. There were no signs of conquest or captivity here. Children with sun-bronzed skin and light-colored eyes played alongside elders who wore both silver crosses and carved shell pendants. The expedition leader demanded to speak with their governor, but an elderly woman stepped forward, carrying a woven sash whose intricate raised knots mapped every river mile of the territory. Beside her stood a tall man with ink-stained fingers who bore the unmistakable features of Thomas Harriot's lineage. They did not answer to the English crown, nor did they owe allegiance to any single chief. The physical settlement at Roanoke had not been destroyed, it had simply evolved. Driven by survival and guided by the secret woven ciphers, the lost settlers and the Croatan people had chosen integration over extinction. They had quietly stepped off the pages of written history and forged a self-sustained world in the shadows of the American wilderness. When the surveyors eventually returned to the coast, they reported only impenetrable swamps and empty woods. Some secrets were too profound for empires to own, leaving the true fate of Roanoke safely preserved within the unwritten horizon.